Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about all things accessibility and why it is such a fundamental, important step for all organisations to consider in becoming the best possible business they can be and in meeting their objectives. Today I'm joined by Hector Minto, Microsoft's Global Director of Commercial Accessibility. Hector, thank you for joining us, and please tell me a bit more about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, well, firstly, it's great to be back with Transparity. When I joined Microsoft 9 years ago, it's one of the first companies who kind of saw that this was a commercial conversation, and essentially that's what I do. I'm working with governments, enterprise customers, disability community around the world, and our sales teams around the world with partners to drive more conversations about disability, cultural, what it means to be somebody with a disability in the workplace or as a customer, and then accessibility, which is the deliverable. So making sure that we're building technology that just works for people with disabilities. So across the globe, we have an amazing group of Microsoft employees essentially taking this topic on as part of what they do and driving that local conversation.
So why does accessibility matter so much within the workplace?
Yeah, the demographics are there for all to see. When I started, 1 in 6 people with a disability is what we kind of talked about. Now we talk 1 in 5, 1 in 4 sometimes because we've added neurodiversity and mental health are really big conversations right now across society. But essentially, the demographics suggest there are a lot of people with disabilities, either disabilities people are born with or that acquire during their lifetime. And when we think about tech, if you can't use it, it's not much use. And so accessibility as a deliverable is really one of those topics that's going to only grow in importance. The more that we are expecting people to use a digital experience, as opposed to an in-person experience, when we think about across the industries, it's going to be incredibly important that we don't just exclude this huge population that's out there.
So over the years, how have you seen accessibility in terms of how technology can support it? How have you seen that grow and evolve?
It is the question. So like I started this 30 years ago. It was, it was niche. I think that's the only way to describe it. In fact, we weren't even using computers back then, right? That was about people reading the newspapers or controlling their homes or accessing their television or their lights. So the conversation was all about independent living, really. Now we live with our tech, right? So the conversation has moved from being very user-centered. So it's been we have this person with a disability, how do they access this thing? And now it's become more systemic. So we're looking at industries, the banks, the hospitals, the education establishments, the government services. The more the technology becomes the lead experience, that's really the big change. So it's moving from being a niche, bespoke experience to being more the one that has to be built in en masse for organisations.
And can you give me some examples of how it's evolved from the early days then? You talked about people being able to access basic services, turn on their television, for example. What are we looking at as that has evolved over the years and how that's changed?
Yeah, so first things first, it was all about when it started, it was about how does this person who cannot do this thing, having a piece of assistive tech that does it. Now we're talking about the built infrastructure being more accessible. So if we think about, say, somebody who's blind, they will use a screen reader, which means they will listen to text content rather than see it, okay? So the technology that they will get that. They will get the technology in front of them. But when they actually start to interface with an experience, their banking, their lectures, whatever it might be, their content, that also has to be built accessible. And that's not their responsibility, that becomes the responsibility of society.
And why do you think that now more than ever employers and businesses are looking to build that in? Because of course that is an investment, isn't it? And it's not just about the fact that they may have to comply with certain regulations. What do you think the driver is here?
Yeah, people is the straight answer. The conversation's getting louder. There's no getting away from it. If we look across all of the major companies that I've worked with in the last 9 years, they've got their employee resource groups. They're having a conversation about what it means to be a person with a disability working in that organisation. And they are looking at it and thinking, well, how do we support our employees, both as groups, as employee resource groups, but then that's reaching management, where they're seeing we have legal requirements to make sure that we're offering equality within the workplace. And then they also want to make sure they're not locking out people with disabilities from joining their companies and their organisations. Governments have a very specific challenge. So the disability employment gap, wherever we can see it globally, it's like double for people with disabilities. So if you have a disability, you're twice as likely to be unemployed wherever we sort of see this information. And so governments are starting to put some pressure back on companies and employers, particularly major employers, to start looking at their representation, either through quotas or things like disability pay gaps. That's one of those kind of new conversations that's really started to evolve. But the answer to your question is, the lived experience of people with disabilities inside organisations, they're just getting more deliberate. I mean, I don't think it's not even kind of it's not a tense conversation, it's more, people are more, certainly this generation coming through, they're way more likely to have a conversation about their disability. You know, when I think about I'm 50 now, or 51, and when, you know, people would hide their disabilities. Yeah, so like people who were deaf in the workplace, they just wouldn't talk about it. People with limb amputations would cover their limb amputation. Yeah, now, you know this. You sort of see people around the UK now. Like people walk around with amputated limbs on full display. Yeah, people are colouring in their cochlear implants as fashion aids.
Yes.
Yeah, so the conversation's getting louder, more confident, and when that happens, it just becomes more obvious that, you know, if you're having that conversation inside an organisation, let's do something. And to put it bluntly, Microsoft technology plays a critical role here. You know, if you cannot access Teams, Office, you know, whatever it might be, you know, your SharePoint, if you can't access these systems, then it's much harder for you to work in that organisation. So you can have the cultural demand that's sort of saying, hey, we need people with disabilities working in this organisation, but then you have the technical deliverable of building things accessible.
I couldn't agree with you more, because I remember the 2012 Olympics and when we advertised the Paralympics and the way in which they did it, it made all of those Paralympiads look like superheroes, you know, because the way in which prosthetics now, you know, look and feel, you're right, people are proud. They have no reason to hide, or they're like under a bushel. So
people talk to me about the legacy. Like whenever you do games, and we're working with the Paralympic Committee right now. I think, you know, getting ready for it's Italy for the winter version. They will always talk about legacy, yeah. And I always say, like London, the legacy was absolutely pride. You know, it was definitely like this became kind of a moment where it wasn't. You know, you didn't have to hide disability. We saw programs like The Last Leg. It's on Channel 4 on a Friday night. It's still going. It's 2025. It's still here, right? But it's because there was this cultural moment where it was like, we're going to talk about this topic. We're not going to run away from it. The superhero thing didn't land with everybody. Because I say, like, this is my generation that kind of went, oh, do we feel like this is superhero? You know, because there are elements of being disabled that are still, you know,
really
grotty. You know, it's like the experience can be difficult. You know, you are excluded from things. Taxis will refuse guide dogs still in 2025, right? You know, so you know, the optimism is great, yeah. The deliverable still has to happen, and so I would argue we're now getting to a point where it's like we're looking back on things like 2012 and saying, yep, we've got the pride now, but there's still the work that has to be done. You can't get away with just saying, oh, we're super proud, you know, we're going to wear the lanyard. You now have to also say, well, we've got to build systems to be accessible. One of the biggest legacies of London, particularly London 2012, is this city is much more accessible, you know, like across the space. You know, if you want to get on the Elizabeth line and get, you know, from here to Canary Wharf now, it is beautifully accessible all the way. Actually, and with people in the stations ready to support you with confidence, you know, not as a kind of a, you know, queuing up to meet the disability meet and greet in the station. You know, I remember what honestly, it was awful in previous generations. And I'm not saying it's perfect now, but it's just more confident now. It's more kind of matter of fact, which is kind of, you know, the way it should be.
So we talk about the fact that obviously businesses are embracing with more positivity and happiness, but there is still the law to be followed.
Yep.
There are regulations to be met.
Yep.
And that's a path that businesses have to navigate.
Yeah.
Could you talk through in a little bit more detail perhaps what those regulations mean for companies, how they can navigate them, the things that are most important for them to consider?
Yeah, so it's different across different parts of the world,
Yep.
but if we kind of focus on the UK here now, you've got the equality duty, which essentially means that you are duty bound as an employer to not discriminate against your employees. It's really as simple as that. But as I said, the kind of the knowledge of employees with disabilities is getting greater, and therefore not providing accommodations or adjustments in the workplace to allow somebody with a disability to be as productive as they want to be within the workplace, that's really on the employer now. And so HR professionals are looking at it now and saying, well, actually, what role does tech play in this? That's the bit we have the best thing. You know, it's not just tech, it's also policies and all sorts of things. But essentially, you as an employer have to make sure that you're providing everything. Now, accommodations or adjustments, depending on how you describe them, used to be quite a kind of a long drawn-out process. So if you think about that person who's lost their hearing in the workplace, okay, well, what would you do? Well, you would have to probably have some kind of scribe for meetings. You may have to provide that. You would then maybe have to provide sign language interpretation, which is still, a need. But the technology is playing a much greater role now, and it's also adding to the flexibility of the employee experience. So my boss, Jenny Layflower, is the Chief Accessibility Officer of Microsoft globally. She's deaf. And I've watched her experience in my 9 years here, going from you had to coordinate every meeting and lock every meeting in and book the interpreter, yeah, and then Teams came along with its auto captioning, and then it got a lot more flexible. We could meet any time. Yeah. Occasionally now, I'll ring her while she's driving in her car, and she's still able to kind of, hopefully while she's at the traffic lights, kind of follow along on the subtitles. But you get the point.
Safely.
The tech is evolving. The flexibility of employing people with disabilities, and I mean, it'd be great to talk about neurodiversity now, mental health, and these sorts of things, where that's also, tech's also starting to play a role there. Yeah, but essentially the tech is a constant add-on, to support people with disabilities, and employers. I don't think it's going to be individual case by individual case now moving forward. The responsibility will be to provide a flexibly digitally inclusive workplace, captions turned on, etc.
So talking more about sort of neurodiversity, can you give me some examples of how technology is supporting people who are neurodiverse? I myself know, have friends with ADHD and autism, for example. So therefore I know full well that, in the workplace, there are lots of people with lots of different things that they have to manage and deal with.
Maybe I could just add a little bit of context first, because it's interesting that when I think through kind of, as I say, long time working in this space, technology was always quite about delivering the functional experience. So if you couldn't hear something, well, there's tech for that. If you can't see something, there's tech for that. Yeah, if you couldn't press a button, you had a physical disability or a mobility issue, then tech would be added on to kind of support that. We didn't really do neurodiversity or mental health. Or we did cognition, interestingly, kind of what we would term in the UK learning disability. There were quite nice bespoke technologies for this. But neurodiversity in particular, I think, was kind of almost like the poor relation in terms of what the tech could do. But generative AI, and of course we're going to say Copilot, but Copilot is it's astonishing how that landed when with the neurodiverse communities inside workplaces when that got out. I don't think it's made it into the the consumer side quite as much as it will.
Right.
Trust me, that's coming. Right, that is coming. But in the workplace, we really started to hear very early on. So the minute you had a Copilot next to you, in M365, and you had a long document, suddenly somebody who's ADHD is going, well, I don't have to read the whole thing. I can just quickly summarize it, and it's good. Yeah. And it may be that, yes, I probably do have to read the whole thing, but to get me through this meeting, bullet it for me. Yeah, like the first prompts we saw in M365 from people with ADHD were, I'm not reading this whole thing, please read the whole thing and provide 4 bullet points, no more than 4 bullet points, go. Yeah. So what happened was, because we were having a kind of an active conversation around disability already as Microsoft, and this is honestly, this is what I'm kind of almost like proud about, is that when Copilot landed in the workplace, they were already ready to have this conversation, because Microsoft was already there talking about all the other aspects of accessibility. But all of my salespeople, essentially, our account teams and our partners, we're out there already having that conversation really early, not waiting for it to happen. And the feedback we got very quickly was, it's a neurodiversity win. Yeah, it is somebody who's autistic, let's say, who's worried about the tone of their email. Am I being blunt here? I don't often always read these signs. Copilot, am I being blunt in this response? Could you help me make it more professional? Go. Yeah. Now, that's for each individual to kind of decide how they wanted to use it, but it was really clear really quickly that this community was coming back to us saying exactly how they would write it. People who are dyslexic, the biggest thing, all my career has been this fear of the blank page. Yeah, it's like, I've been asked to do this task, but my dyslexia is really even stopping me getting started. Actually, I'm thinking back to kind of PowerPoint designer back in the day, like even before AI, we used it then for people who are dyslexic to kind of give them a starting point into a document. But Copilot came along and it was like, no, now I can get a really good first draft out real quick, and then I can add my personality to it afterwards. But yeah, it's when I contextualize it, tech used to be very kind of functional. How do we take away the disability essentially through adding this functional assistive technology? and it's moved now to almost like what I would call like social assistive tech, like helping me with the tone of an email is not a, it's not, the email still gets written, yeah, like, but it's not a functional barrier. It's more, actually, my disability means that my tone is often not great. That's a social thing, and I get, probably coming across, I get quite excited about that because it's like, there's a whole new sphere of assistive technology that we're going to start talking about.
I think it's wonderful because, everybody needs that second pair of eyes or that other person to say, am I being too direct? Am I getting my point across? But for people that really do struggle with certain tones of voice, I mean, I can imagine it's transformative. And I know that it has landed incredibly well with, people who are neurodiverse. Talk to me a little bit more about the business benefits of employing people that are neurodiverse, that may have disabilities, because obviously a lot of businesses might think, yes, I need to comply with these regulations, I have to be able to be seen to be doing certain things, but it's more than that. By employing people from different walks of life, there are benefits to business. I'm assuming that you can talk to those for me.
100%. I mean, look, first things first, the community is already there, right? No. Like there's a kind of an attraction element of like, hey, could we bring more people with more diversity into our organisation? And all of the kind of the studies on having diverse teams are there. Different perspectives. Every organisation's kind of aching for kind of different perspectives to kind of keep things alive, refreshed. I think, and all businesses of all sizes, and at any stage of their existence, are kind of talking to this. But disability in particular is interesting because there's a design element that people with disabilities require. So the rest of us will kind of muddle along, okay? But the minute somebody with a disability is literally saying, I can't use this, then it drives an innovation. It drives, well, actually, hang on, you can't be the only person who can't use this. I always talk about the blurred background in Teams. Everyone, the blurred background?
Yes.
That came from lip reading, that came from disability, and Microsoft were the first to do it. Now, had Swetha, who was the engineer who created that, who was a lip reader herself, not said, all of these faces, all of these messy backgrounds, this is exhausting for me, and I know we've got this new technology, and could we add this into Teams? It's actually Skype, actually, back then. But having that person in the room say it is very different from, okay, let's build our product and let's go out to research with our consumers. What I noticed was people who'd built careers in a bit of kind of accessibility expertise were suddenly moving into engineering teams. They weren't sitting in the in the specialist team anymore. They were moving into the actual team who were building that kit. And so when you looked at the contrast themes that came into Windows 11, so anybody who's watching this that's blind, low vision, or low vision, the old experience, if people remember back to old version of Windows, when you put it into contrast mode, it was like, we hate you. I mean, and I mean that in the nicest way possible, but it was ugly. It was so ugly. It was so blocky. When you magnified it, it looked disgusting. And it was basically because it was like a legal requirement. It's like, oh, we've got to make this visible for people with low vision. So, okay, well, we'll put somebody on that and let them go do it. The Windows 11 one was beautiful. The contrast themes, you would all live perfectly happily in those contrast themes. But the reason it was beautiful is because you had some amazing people like Jeremy, in my team, working in that team, saying, I'm not putting up with an ugly alternative for something. I'm in this team. This is my product. Let's make this beautiful. And I think that's the in absolute summary, that's the difference. Is that if you don't have people within your organisations, really telling home truths about what it's like and what it's like to use this thing, it will get moved further and further down the kind of the design process. It will maybe get forgotten about altogether, but having people embedded in your organisation who are ready to talk about their experiences, that's what leads to designing for delight, and that's better. And design for delight always keeps you legal. Yeah, designing for legal minimum bar always keeps you on the very edge of being illegal, or attracting legal risk. Whereas actually pushing way further than that to delight is honestly the benefit. And then what it leads to is the classic curb cut effect, inclusive design, where you discover something like the blurred background that everybody goes, well, like loads of people would benefit from that, wouldn't they? Right, but you don't get there unless you have the person who's excluded kind of raising their hand and saying, could we do better here? But this applies to every industry. Yeah, it really does.
So going back to AI, obviously it is the topic of conversation in technology, but even in society in general at the moment. What do you see as being the core benefits AI can bring? I know we've touched upon Copilot's ability to summarize, make points, help with tone of voice, but also moving to the future, Microsoft, very innovative, forward-looking organization, always wanting to do the best for its customers. Talk to me a little bit about what you see coming down the line.
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, so people with disabilities have been in the AI space for some time. So before we got to generative AI, we just had cognitive services, you know, the classic Azure, here are the cognitive services like the immersive reader and the image recognition. And so we were already using those tools to innovate around disability. But this new Gen AI age is just a new toolkit. There's a new toy box. I mean, it's like, wow. Like, things that we thought were impossible are now going to be possible. The one that I smile about, I'm going to say 6 years ago, we had Anne Taylor, who's blind, on the main stage at Future Decoded. I remember Transparity were there with me then as well, talking about this. But she's blind, and she was on stage, main stage, at a big event, 4,000 people I think it was. It was like huge, it felt like. And she was saying, look, you know, she was showing all the accessibility, you know, that we were adding, using what we would have called AI back then. Yeah. And then she was like, but one day I'm going to be able to open up a graph, you know, an Excel spreadsheet with some illustrations, with some visual data, and AI is going to be able to help me interpret visual data. And we were all like, yeah, come on, we are going to go and do that, right? Yeah. But what was great was she knew that's the direction of travel. You know, she worked in our innovation team. She could see where this was all going and what was going to be possible. And what's going to happen for people with disabilities is the whole experience will change. So there's boring structural accessibility. You should all be making your documents accessible. Okay? Great color contrast, headings, navigation built into your documents. There's an amazing accessibility checker built into Office that teaches you how to do that. But also, one day, and actually the day is today, honestly, this is happening now. These are Ray-Ban glasses, okay? These have AI built into them. I've got Copilot in there as well. But now somebody who's blind can go to a document and say, what am I looking at here? Now, there are dangers in all of that, right? In terms of, is it giving legal, legitimate information? There's some industries that are going to go, we're not going near this for now. Yeah. But if we were to say, if I was looking at a menu in a restaurant right now, I could sit there and go, well, I'm vegetarian, what can I eat on this menu? And the AI will do that for me. Now, we would all love that, in a way. I mean, do we? I don't know. But you know, conceptually, we would all like that. But for somebody who's blind, yeah, that is a game changer. Yeah. And so it goes back to this designing for delight. I think what generative AI is going to turn what used to be clunky, hard experiences around making stuff accessible into much more delightful experiences. One of the first case studies we published, and we can maybe share the link to it, is what we did with the Rijksmuseum. All of the artwork in the Rijksmuseum, if you're blind, you can have a conversation with now. Yeah? And have a conversation with is such a great conversation about how people are going to use their tools in the future. What generative AI allows you to do is not just see this functional, ugly experience read to you in a legally compliant way, great. It allows you to have a conversation with it. Yep. So if I look at, for example, a political polls tracker, you know, these graphs, or who's closing in the polls and all this sort of stuff, I can now have a conversation with that visual data. What happened there? Why do you think it was? And then it will go into the internet and say, well, there was a stock market crash then or something. Right? You know, it will start adding some context into the data that I'm looking at. So the whole point, and what the disability community are going to teach us real early, they're going to be the first adopters of this, is up until now you have had a functional conversation with your customers and your business. What you're going to have in the future is a richer conversation with an AI element to it, built on your company's data and all this kind of stuff. But the whole interaction experience that we're going to have with tech in the future is going to be what we've always called multimodal. It's going to be lots of ways to input in, lots of ways to receive information out. But that's really the sea change that I see coming for people with disabilities and it'll take a while for it to kind of get out into the society. That's always the bit I feel kind of a bit itchy about. It's like, we have these great conversations inside business, but is it reaching Mrs. Jones in Altrincham, you know, and that's the bit I really want to kind of focus on and make sure we're dealing with moving forward. But the first it starts with, people with disabilities and AI will be the first people to teach us how to use it properly, because they're going to be so exposed to it in the kind of they're going to have to use some of these tools, and therefore they're going to kind of be some of the first adopters.
I think what's exciting for me listening to you is that a lot of people will talk about how AI may threaten their job or threaten their livelihood. It's the exact opposite. AI is an enabler.
It is, but I don't think we should ignore, how people feel about kind of, like it's always, I think, when new technology comes out, people think, oh, like, how's it going to impact me in this job now? How many times in this podcast have I mentioned my age? I mean, like, okay, but like when I was at school, you did train to be a thing. You don't train to be a thing anymore. You train to go and like you develop your human skills of communication, hard work, effort, all these sorts of things, just massively human attributes. But this idea that you're going to stay in the same job, these job sections are just going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, but the jobs will keep changing. And the idea that everything's fixed in society is just not true. Yeah, like there's a lot to do out there. And I just think the way maybe I'm too optimistic, I hope I'm not, but essentially where I look at it is, yes, there will be things that kind of AI is immediately applied to, but what will humans do when they're sitting there going, well, what do I spend my time doing next, and what role do I move into next? There's a lot of things to fix in society, and I just don't see us sitting still and going, oh, I'll just sit at home now. I hope we're not. I've got kids myself, and so I think about this all the time. Here's what I will say to my kids. Sorry if this is even remotely interesting.
No, please.
But I do think it kind of gets to it. It's like, get all the skills you can, but the skills are going to change. You're never going to stop learning. Like I haven't. I'm a chemist. I didn't stay there. But work out what industry you want to work in. Because if you work out what industry you want to work in, you'll get in, and then you will shift to wherever you go. But sort of aligning yourself with the industry and the purpose of the industry and something that you love or that you're interested in, I think to me is the best advice we can give people. And then AI will play a role in sort of how we all work as humans. The risk of AI is that it homogenizes everything as well. And so the absolute bit about what makes us productive and human, that will be what becomes more valuable. And then just to bring it full circle, that's what the disabled community can teach us every single day. Yeah.
I think it's really exciting for me because what you're effectively saying is it's a dialogue, it's an interaction. Technology doesn't exist in isolation, neither does a community within this world, and they will interact, they will inform each other, and they will support innovation on both sides. And as you say, we have a lot to learn from the disability community in terms of what they can bring to us and they can bring to the whole, tech for accessibility question. If we move on to just my final thoughts and words, what would you say is the most important thing for businesses to take forwards as they embrace the age of AI and do their best to employ and understand the needs of people with disabilities, and more than that, benefit from employing people with disabilities?
So just in the age of AI, the data that will be missing will be the people who are excluded from the experiences you build. And that can go across language, literacy, disability. Any kind of excluded group will be excluded by the data that you build your systems on. So first things first, if we're missing data in the AI systems that we build, we're going to attract the regulator further down the track. Yeah, it's like if somebody can't use what you're building, that's when society says, well, why is this person being discriminated against? So first things first, AI, we're doing a lot of work inside Microsoft right now on kind of whose data is not in the AI. We've got to be proactively working to make sure that we're getting that, so that we can drive these equitable experiences. And then the guidance that I would give to anybody who's looking at this topic of accessibility, maybe frame it this way. Some companies are obsessed with their legal requirements to their customers, but they're not doing a great job with their own colleague experience. And then there's other organizations that I meet who are just like massively doing a great job on the inclusion agenda within their organization, but those professionals are not sitting there thinking, well, what's it like for the customers? And what I would say to people is link these together. And in the middle, add skilling. Building things inclusive, and forget accessible for them, just inclusive of a wide group of humans, it doesn't happen just by accident. You've got to be super deliberate about doing it. But these horizons of colleague experiences, skills and capability, and then innovating for your customers, if we can coordinate customers to start linking these conversations, frankly, even between professionals. Like the HR director should be talking to the brand person and saying, how do we link disability inclusion across all, everything that we do? Remember, Microsoft did Super Bowl ads on disability. When people say to me, like, why is it important to Microsoft? Well, it made Super Bowl ads. It made Super Bowl ads because Microsoft was saying to the world, this is a Microsoft that wants to include everybody moving forward. It's like, we've come from the first 25 years or wherever we were at the time of like building software and making it work for people. But as we move forward, we've got to build it for everybody. And that brand experience or that brand messaging of inclusion really came through in the accessibility work that we're doing. So linking your representation and what talent and voice you have within your organization, nurturing that, will lead to you building more inclusive digital experiences, but only if you deliberately link the two.
So just another couple of questions for you, Hector. Obviously, Transparity works very closely with our customers, and I'm thinking of organisations like RNIB, where we have sought to deliver real benefit to their employees. And there is a role we play in enabling businesses. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more to how Microsoft and partners like Transparity can deliver those benefits.
Absolutely. So, firstly, thank you for doing that work. I mean, you are the final mile for us. I also think it's almost like we talk hypothetically sometimes as Microsoft, but unless partners are out there doing that final piece for us, all the work we do kind of just stays where it was. So you having that deliberate conversation and actually working with customers who've got that very specific need, like the RNIB, and congratulations on the award. I mean, I was cheering, that when I saw it on social. But what that teaches you as your team is, this is how you do it, because this customer really needs it. They've got the established need and they're showing us. But hopefully then that diffuses out into kind of other customers where it's not so obvious, but you do the work anyway. You realize you can build, those accessible systems, those accessible business applications for that customer. I think that's important. And that's really what it's all about for me. It's like the partners will go do the work. Microsoft increasingly becomes that general purpose technology provider. It's like, look, we're building these tools, we've got this AI, we've got this opportunity to build more inclusive. But unless I've got people out there having a commercial conversation about accessibility day in, day out, we don't make progress as society. So that's the role, and thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Hector, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's been an absolutely inspiring and insightful discussion. Please, if you have any questions, do get in contact with Transparity. And once again, embrace accessibility to the delight of your colleagues, your customers.